Now we move to mind state. Out of those three domains in the model that I've presented to you, brain state, learn state, we've now come to mind state. One of the flagship ideas is one that maybe some of you have heard me talk about before, this idea of the red brain or the red zone, blue zone model. I refer to both red zone and blue zone and red brain, blue brain, increasingly these days. It makes more sense in teaching to kids especially to talk about red brain and blue brain as a model. So you'll probably hear me interchange those quite a bit. This is a model that's based on originally, and many of you have heard me talk about this before, 3 layers of the brain. But I'm not going to do that today. First of all, I want to be a bit briefer in my explanation, but I'm moving away and stepping away from this idea of 3 layers. It's breaking down a bit in the view of neuroscience, and the brain is massively interconnected and clearly doesn't have 3 distinct layers to it operationally. Instead, I'm going to talk about and reference what is costly or expensive to the brain, what is efficient, and what is automatic. And at the back of the brain, you can see we've got this cerebellum. In the middle of the brain, we've got the limbic system, and at the top of the brain, over the top, the pink area there, we have the cortical part of the brain. Now, they are the 3 layers I normally talk about, but I'm not going to distinguish those as individual layers in this session. I just want to give a sense of the brain loves to be efficient. It does what's easiest for the brain, what takes the least amount of resources. And we need to be in a really good state to be using all of our cortex. And when we are using that outer layer of the brain, we are using a lot of metabolic resources. So when we're tired and run down, we shrink back to what's most effective, most efficient. And down at the cerebellum, behind the back of the head there, into the limbic system, those 2 parts of the brain are very, very efficient. They're also to do with survival in lots of ways. So many of the bits and pieces that come together and work together in concert when we're under threat or stress are actually in these lower 2 parts of the brain. When we're working socially and when we're thinking and we're processing, we're problem solving, we're being creative, we're using the outer layer of the brain, and including that is the sensory part of the brain. All bar one of the senses are contained and processed in the cortical part of the brain. So when we're present, and often present with other people, we're using our senses in the cortical part of the brain, and we're also connecting that to many of the social maps and the social regions in the brain, which are very much largely in the prefrontal cortex. So that's the model I'm going to be working through today, and just be aware that it doesn't really matter so much exactly where each part of the blue zone or the red zone, red brain, blue brain, emerge from in the brain, but simply that they do emerge from different locus of controls or loci of controls in the brain, and that they have different impacts and different effects. So if we look at that from this point of view, we can see here that I've named the blue region as that being in the prefrontal cortex down into the limbic section there. And I'm calling the red brain the part that's in the lower part of the brain, the cerebellum, and moving into the emotional part of the brain, the limbic system. The common ground for both of these mind states is in fact the limbic system in the middle. And a key player in this is the amygdala that you can see outlined there. We've got 2, one either side. And the amygdala has itself a very complex, multi-layered set of roles, but it does play a part in stress detection, in vigilance, in fear, in stress and threat. And when it's activated, it starts to activate the survival architecture. And when that survival architecture is working and is dominating, then we get the things that are just underneath me there. It's all about me. We have lower situational awareness. That is, we have lower awareness of ourselves, lower awareness of others, and the interplay of the situation between ourselves and others. And we have lower self-management and choice as well. So that means literally when I'm in this red brain state, I'm either in one of 3 or 4 different states, but we know them as fight, flight, and freeze. And there's another one, there's a 4th one that's come up that I keep forgetting, and you might reference that in some of the notes. But when we're in fight or flight, especially, or freeze, then we're largely in this red brain region. And a lot of our logic and our language starts to shut down, because our language is very much in the cortical part of the brain. And we become focused through our emotions on something that's external to us, that's the threat, the cause of the problem, if you like. And through that, we see the outcomes and the behaviours in those 3 points on the right-hand side. Typically, the most important one is our awareness is dropped and it's all about me. And this is what we see in 2-year-olds when you're at the shop and they want the chocolate or the toy, and they lay on the floor kicking and screaming, and they don't care. They're not in a point where they can care about the impact on you, because that's not a part of the frame of reference for the red brain. Thinking about other people is not in the frame of reference for the red brain. We saw recently with COVID that lots of people were judged badly for being selfish and taking resources that were very low, toilet paper being one. And people judged them and said, that's not right. And it wasn't right. But those people were in a state of threat to the extent where they were unable to really process the impact of their behaviour on others. And therefore they were in a very primitive part of their brain, a much less developed part of their brain. So it's almost impossible to judge them, because they didn't really have a choice. Their choices were narrowed. Once we're in a better place, and this is a more expensive place for the brain to be, when we connect our prefrontal cortex, that part behind our forehead and behind our eyes, with the emotional centre, with the intuition that sits in the limbic part of the brain. So when we combine those two parts of the brain, or those two regions of the brain, we start to get the interplay of my ability to articulate and name things, with being able to be aware of what those emotions are and the impact that they might have. When those two brain regions combine, we get a mind state that's much more about us or you, high situational awareness. So that means we can start to be much more aware of how our brain and how our body and how our behaviour is impacting on other people and how they impact on us. And through this mind state, we also have greater access to choice. A quick way to illustrate this is when we get really angry in the car, we zero in with our vision on the cause, the person who caused the problem for us, and we start not to see or really be aware of things around us. The more angry and more pinpointed we get with that anger, the less that we see stuff around us. And that broad awareness that we get allows us to see things we couldn't see before. So if we pull this away from the brain and just look at this as a conceptual model, then on the left-hand side we get this red brain or red zone area, and this is the child state. In fact, kids are born with this state, and that makes sense. They need to be in a survival state when they first arrive, and when they don't have language, they need to communicate and let us know the needs that they have, and it is all about them, and they don't need situational awareness. They don't need lots of choice. We are the choices for them. We make the choices. So it doesn't make sense from a biological point of view to come into this world with a strongly working blue zone. Part of the role of education and teaching and relationships with children as parents or teachers is to move them over time from left to right in this screen, develop them so that they start to build their blue zones, their blue brains over time. The blue brain doesn't become evident in kids until about the age of 8 or so, plus or minus. I don't know how much plus or minus. Yeah, some kids are earlier, some kids later. And as the brain starts to get socially more aware and the impact of my behaviour on others becomes available to me, and in return the impact of others on me, then I'm starting to develop the social architecture that's associated with the blue brain. And with social emotional learning, with language, with emotional intelligence, with emotional literacy, we can start to move kids towards the right. That part of the brain, the research is suggesting mid-20s to 30s, and earlier in females, later in males, for the completion of the blue zone and its development. A couple of quick points here. The red zone, you can be happy. This is not about happy and sad. It's not that simple. It is determined by my orientation, me or you, and my awareness and my choice. And what we can have is situations where you can be really happy, but in a very selfish way, and that would be described as a red brain mind state. Similarly, you can be quite unhappy and quite dissatisfied, but be so in a very unselfish way that's much more socially oriented. And so it's not about the actual affect being the state of emotion. So now you understand that progression from child to adult state through that progression. The other thing I want to point out on this slide is that the red brain state is very fast. It's very fast to act because it's survival focused. It's very easy to fall into this state, and it's very, very contagious. Emotions are contagious anyway. There's almost this zone around you that extends out into the space in front of you that people can detect your emotions at a very low non-language level. And so that's that contagion that occurs with emotions. And certainly the survival focused, threat focused emotions of the red brain are very, very contagious. If you've got a classroom and the classroom's becoming unruly and you bang the table and you point at one child and say, "Peter, that's it, get out of my room, I'm sick of you," and you do so in a quite strongly, visibly angry way, then that emotion that you've given to that child is actually caught by all the other kids around. And the net culture, if you like, of the classroom descends. All of the kids in the classroom descend from being in the blue zone to some extent back into the red. So all of the kids start to move towards being self-centered, low awareness and low control. So that's not really a good way of managing the classroom. When we look at the blue brain, it is slower to get going. It's more intensive on the resources. It takes effort, but it's still contagious. And we know that there are things, particularly when we see compassion and empathy, when someone gives you empathy, that empathy is contagious to other people who see that. So empathy is connected here to the blue zone in particular. So a couple of quick ways now moving into the practical aspect of this. If we've got a situation where we're in a red brain state, or we've got people around us, kids around us that are in a red brain state, the way to move out of that and start to engage some of the blue brain activity, first of all, is to be emotionally literate, to name the emotion. Now, a lot of neuroscience shows that when you name an emotion, you reduce the impact that emotion is having on you. This is called affect labeling, if you want to look this up. And it relies heavily on the ability to be articulate with emotions. So one of the things I'll show you in a second is how to start to build emotional literacy with kids in the classroom. This happens, by the way, because you're using your blue zone architecture to name the emotion, and your brain's blood supply and your brain's resources move to the areas of higher activity. So the brain shuffles and moves its resources around. So if you move resources towards the blue zone, then you're moving them away from the red zone, and that starts to mediate down the red zone. The other thing you can do with equal effect is to reframe the story. So if you're looking at the situation from a red brain point of view, ask a question, how can I see this differently? And start to retell a story that's a little bit more helpful and puts you in a different place. This is also used in a lot of interventions and is quite effective. It sounds a bit naff in the sense that you know that it may not be true, but the new narrative that you can bring does impact on you. And I've used this for several situations, particularly traveling, where I've started to get grumpy in the moment of traveling, queues and those sorts of things. And if I reframe, then I'm in a situation where I can manage down my red zone and be in a better place for those around me. So I spoke about emotional literacy before. First of all, when teaching younger children, we need to teach the 8 basic emotions. And this is one piece of work that is really central to some of the social emotional learning. Boys in particular seem to need this more than girls, but lots of kids, all kids need this. Knowing these emotions, knowing how to name them, knowing what their purpose is, and knowing how to detect them on the faces of those people around us is critical learning for all kids. And this is one of the ways that we can start this. As we develop this into deeper complexity, this is much more appropriate for older kids. And you can see now this whole idea of, and this has some slightly different labels on it, but you can see how those basic emotions on the left-hand side start to be expressed in different ways in what's called the emotional wheel. And there are different versions of this one. This one's from positive psychology, and I really quite like this one. This is a really good discussion point for older kids in particular. You can see that fear is a combination of surprise and awe. I love the one that they describe love as being joy and trust together. So the complexity of emotions can be unpacked over time and built out through a mechanism of building the emotional literacy that goes with identifying complex emotions. So if someone was to say, I've got some real interest in this, or I'm being hyper vigilant about this situation, I'm quite surprised, or I'm amazed, or I loathe this situation. These are words that help us manage our emotions very importantly and are connected strongly to self-regulation. So that's the main idea, red zone, blue zone. To summarize, blue zone is that state, or blue brain is that state where you have an orientation to us or you have greater awareness, and you have greater choice. When we're in our red brain state, we have a lowered set of choices. We are much lower in our general awareness of ourselves and others, and we have a very strong me orientation. Where we need people to be, specifically because this is where people learn the best, is very much in their blue brains. When kids are young, we need to help develop that pathway. As they're getting older, we need to emphasize those parts of the brain that are in the blue brain or the blue zone domain. You can see that this is very much about this model here on the left of knowing, being, and sharing. So you need to know this from your own self-management point of view, particularly as a professional in a difficult setting. Classrooms are crazy places, and you need to keep your cool. Calm under pressure is knowing this model. Calm under pressure is exercising those processes that help you manage down red zones. Breathing is one that I've not mentioned yet. Deep breathing impacts the vagus nerve, and that does some stuff in the brain besides giving you more oxygen and then giving the brain more capability of being in this more expensive part of the brain. So knowing, moving to being is really important. But this is one model that's really important to share with children. And I've seen classrooms use this blue brain, red brain model in teaching to quite young children, year 1, year 2 level children, and younger in some cases. And I've heard of anecdotes from teachers where children can start to self-regulate by saying, I've fallen into my red brain state, I need to go and do this to get back to restore, to come back into my blue brain. Clearly I'm paraphrasing, but we're getting kids articulating what their needs are because they've recognized what state they're in. So 3 questions that I want you to take away from this. The what. What have you picked up from this? What's your knowledge that you really have extended? If you've seen this for the first time, you'll get some new knowledge. If you've seen this before, people say every time they see this, they pick up a new nuance on this. So what's your new bit of information at the know level? So what? What does this do to impact you? How does this change how you'll be, both as a professional in the classroom, but in life generally? This works at home just as much as in the classroom. And the what next? What will you do with this, either in the way that you teach this to your kids or the way that you help your colleagues? Again, I hope this has been interesting and helpful for you.